So hi, I'm David Friedell. I teach in the philosophy department, and I'm going to be talking to you about the case of the puzzling decision, how the Supreme Court handles or mishandles homophobia and the patriarchy. So you might have missed it because there was a lot going on in 2020, but there was also a really big Supreme Court decision which raised a few questions. One of the questions this case raised was whether it's legal for an employer to fire someone based on their sexuality. And the court decided that it is illegal. It is illegal for an employer to fire someone based on their sexuality. And the Supreme Court decided that this was made illegal in 1964 when Congress banned gender discrimination in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So in other words, the Supreme Court has argued that when Congress banned gender-based discrimination, they also thereby banned sexuality-based discrimination. So you might be wondering, how can that be? You might think gender discrimination and sexuality discrimination are two different things. So here is how the court argued that sexuality discrimination and gender-based discrimination are connected. Consider the following. A gay man is fired by a homophobic boss, so the boss has fired them for being a gay man. The court says that we should think about the following hypothetical scenario. Would he, the gay man, have been fired if he were instead a woman? Okay, I invite you to think about this hypothetical. Okay, so 6 of the Supreme Court justices say no. This gay man would not be fired if he were a woman, because if he were a woman who dates or is attracted to men, he would not be fired. So, the court says, this man who's being fired for being attracted to or dating men is not only being discriminated against based on their sexuality, but is also being discriminated based on their gender. In other words, in this case, a man is being fired for something a woman would not be fired for. So he's being fired, at least in part, as a man. Okay. The other 3 justices, though, say it's not so obvious. And in fact, they argued that yes, he still would be fired if he were a woman, because if this gay man were a woman, he would be lesbian. And as long as the homophobic boss fires gay men and lesbian women equally, discriminates against them equally, then the homophobic boss is not discriminating based on gender, but is instead only discriminating based on sexuality. Okay. And as the laughter suggests, some of you might think this is not maybe the best way to think about the relationship between gender discrimination and sexuality discrimination. I just want to confess that as a philosopher, I love thinking about these kinds of hypotheticals, but I appreciate that you might think there's a better way to think about these issues. Okay, there's another concern you might have with this kind of reasoning, which is, what should we say about people who are bisexual, applying this kind of hypothetical reasoning? So if a homophobic employer fires bisexual men and bisexual women equally, how is this gender discrimination? Because to do the hypothetical reasoning, if a bisexual man were a woman, presumably he would be still a bisexual, he would be bisexual woman. So how is this gender discrimination? And you can see once we start playing this game of hypothetical scenarios, it's not clear at all how we should think about this question. And perhaps not so surprisingly, the court is very quiet on this issue. They don't really touch this issue in the opinion. Okay, so now you might really start to suspect that there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a deeper way of thinking about the relationship between sexuality discrimination and gender discrimination. And if that is what you're thinking, you're not alone. So in an amicus or friendly brief to the court, some philosophers and legal scholars argued that there is a better way. And I just want to highlight here Brian Susek, who is one of the authors of this amicus brief, because he kindly and generously zoomed into my philosophy of gender and race class to talk about these issues. So Brian is building upon work of Catherine McKinnon and other feminist legal scholars, and they think that if we really want to think about the connection between sexuality discrimination and gender discrimination, we should think about stereotypes. So along these lines, I invited my students in philosophy of gender and race to break up into groups and to come up with stereotypes that people have about lesbian and bisexual women, and gay and bisexual men. Now, just to be clear, I did not invite my students to come up with stereotypes that they endorsed or agreed with, but just to report stereotypes that society has about these groups of people. So here were some of the stereotypes that we came up with. We threw them on the board. So that lesbian and bisexual women wear flannel, are muscular, good at sports, drive a Subaru, are tomboys, have buzz cuts and short hair, are aggressive. There's a method to this madness, I promise. And on the other side, that gay and bisexual men are feminine, well-dressed, flamboyant, unathletic, sensitive, are into knitting, and good at dancing. Okay, and now I invited my students, as I now invite you, to look at these stereotypes that my students came up with and see if there's anything that they all have in common. And so when I invited my students, they stared at the board and there was silence. And as teachers, we're often not comfortable with silence, but there was a few more moments of silence and a few more moments until one student had an aha moment. They said, aha, all of these stereotypes, without exception, enforce gender norms. So, maybe homophobia just inherently enforces gender norms. So, for example, lesbian women are deemed manly for playing sports, or driving a Subaru, or wearing flannel. Gay men are thought to be feminine for being into fashion, or for being into knitting, or being good at dancing. So if this is right, if homophobia just inherently enforces gender norms, maybe homophobia is itself a form of misogyny. So for example, maybe gay men are punished for acting like women by being into fashion or dancing, etc. And if that's right, that if homophobia is itself a form of misogyny, maybe Title VII just applies straightforwardly. And Title VII really did outlaw not only gender discrimination, but also sexuality discrimination. And if that's right, as much as I love thinking about weird, strange hypotheticals, maybe we don't need them to think about the connection between sexuality discrimination and gender discrimination.